Most people think leaving the wrong situation is the hardest part of change. It usually isn't. The hardest part is what happens next. The moment you're no longer aligned with the old pattern, but you haven't figured out the new one yet. There's a strange moment that happens after someone questions the pattern they've been following for a long time. It's not relief, it's not clarity, it's uncertainty. Because leaving the old structure behind often happens faster than discovering the new one. So people find themselves in a place that feels oddly unfamiliar, not fully aligned with the old version of themselves, but not quite grounded in the new one either. And that middle space is when many people slowly drift back to what they already knew, not because they were wrong to leave, but because the in-between feels unstable. You can see this pattern in small moments of everyday life. Someone finally speaks up in a meeting after staying quiet for months. A person decides to step away from a relationship dynamic that no longer fits. Someone questions a long-standing family expectation, and at first, there's a sense of clarity, almost like fresh air. But shortly after that comes something else. A strange kind of disorientation because the old pattern is gone, but the new pattern hasn't formed yet. And human beings are surprisingly uncomfortable in that kind of space. We like things to make sense. We like clear roles, clear expectations, clear direction. But the moment after change rarely feels clear. It often feels like standing somewhere unfamiliar. You're no longer fully aligned with the old structure, but you're not yet anchored in something new. And that space in between can feel disorientating, unstable, like you stepped off solid ground but haven't quite found your footing yet. And that stretch right there is what I want to talk to you about today, because there's actually a reason the in between feels so uncomfortable, one most people never realize. This is Caffeine and Clarity. I want you to picture something. You're standing on grass, stable ground, familiar footing. You know exactly where you are. Then something shifts. Maybe a realization, maybe a decision, maybe a boundary you finally say out loud. And suddenly, you're no longer on the grass. You've stepped toward the water. Cold at first, uncertain, but the most interesting place isn't the water. And it isn't the grass. It's the shoreline. That narrow stretch where land meets water. Sand under your feet, soft, shifting, not quite solid, not quite fluid, just unstable. That's the in-between. It's the place people stand after questioning the old pattern, but before they steady again. And the more I've thought about it, the more I've started thinking of this moment as the shoreline. And for a lot of people, that space feels deeply uncomfortable because nothing feels settled yet. And this is usually the moment when people turn back, not because the old pattern was right, but because uncertainty is difficult to stand in. There's actually a psychological reason this happens. Our brains are designed to prefer predictability, even when that predictability isn't ideal. Researchers who study decision making have found that people often prefer a familiar discomfort over an unfamiliar possibility because predictability reduces uncertainty, and uncertainty activates the brain's threat response. When a pattern breaks, the brain suddenly loses the map it was using. Even if the old pattern wasn't healthy, it was known. So when someone steps out of a familiar system, whether it's a job structure, a relationship dynamic, or a personal belief, their nervous system doesn't necessarily celebrate the change. It registers instability, which is why the in-between can feel so strange. You're not where you were, but you're not yet confident about where you're going. And that gap is where doubt often gets louder. You can see this dynamic in a lot of different areas of life. In workplaces, Someone might question a long-standing process that no longer works. For a moment, there's clarity. But then there's a period where the team hasn't figured out what replaces it. That space can feel messy. In relationships, someone might decide a certain pattern no longer fits. Maybe they set a boundary for the first time. At first, there's relief. But then comes the adjustment period. The dynamic hasn't fully reformed yet. And that can feel uncomfortable for everyone involved. You see it in identity changes too. When someone shifts careers, leaves a belief system, changes a lifestyle. For a while, they're no longer the version of themselves they used to be, but they're still discovering who they're becoming. And the world tends to prefer clear categories, clear roles, clear definitions. But growth rarely happens in clear definitions. It often happens in those undefined spaces. And that's where things get interesting. Because when people reach that shoreline, many of them turn back, not because the old pattern was better, but because it was familiar. They tell themselves things like, maybe I overreacted. Maybe it wasn't that bad. Maybe I should just go back. But often what they're really responding to is the uncertainty itself. Standing on sand feels unstable, and human beings tend to move quickly toward stability, even if that stability means returning to something they already knew wasn't working. Which raises an interesting question. What if the in-between isn't a problem? What if it's actually part of the process? Maybe that unstable shoreline is where the real adjustment happens. When someone leaves an old pattern, their perspective begins to shift. Their identity starts recalibrating. Their decisions begin forming around a new understanding. And that doesn't happen instantly. It happens gradually, like learning how to find balance on moving sand. At first, the footing feels uncertain, but over time, something changes. Not necessarily the ground, but the way you stand on it. And maybe the real skill isn't rushing back to what felt stable. Maybe the skill is simply recognizing the moment you're in. Understanding the in-between isn't failure. It's transition. Here's your sip of the day. The shoreline may feel unstable, but it's where new landscapes begin. There's another interesting part of this process that we haven't talked about yet. What happens after the in-between? How people start building footing again without rushing back to what was familiar. That's something I want to explore in the next episode. If Caffeine and Clarity has become a steady place for you during the week, you're always welcome to subscribe or leave a comment about what resonated with you today. Those small things help this conversation reach someone else who might need it. And if you ever feel like supporting the channel more directly, there's always a donation option, or you can pick up something from the shop link below. But mostly, I'm really glad you're here. And if you enjoyed this episode, you might enjoy the episode linked here. It connects directly to what we talked about today. Here's something to think about this week. Where are you standing right now? On the grass? In the water? Or somewhere on that shifting shoreline? If you've recently stepped away from something familiar and the next step feels unclear, maybe nothing is wrong. Maybe you're just in the part of the process that doesn't get talked about very often. If this conversation resonated with you, feel free to like the video or subscribe. And if you're comfortable sharing, leave a comment and tell me where you are right now. Grass, shoreline, or water? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Because sometimes the most important changes in our lives don't happen when we arrive somewhere new. They happen in that quiet stretch right in the middle. But for now, if you're standing in that in between, stay.